afternoon and welcome to the last session in the News on the Block Leasehold Knowledge Week. We really appreciate you joining us this week, and we thought we'd end with arguably one of the most important topics, preparing for building safety reform. So it is no surprise that we have invited Dr Shaun Lundy, Director of Strategy and Innovation at Tetra Consulting, a large national health and safety consultancy and a visiting scholar at the University of Greenwich School of Design. Shaun also works closely with the Institute of Residential Property Managers and the Association of Residential Managing Agents, providing advice, training and support as a member of their respective health and safety committees. Shaun supported Working Group 8, developing the I can't even say that. Can I say that? I can't say that word. Competency.
It's a hard word to say.
Oh, I couldn't get it out. Standards for the new building safety manager role, following on from his appointment as chair of the Occupational Safety and Health Register. He recently joined the Building Safety Alliance that is working to develop a I can't got to say that word again.
Competency.
I can't say it.
I just threw it in there to trip you up, Charlotte. That's
you have. I can't get it out. For BSO and the others involved in property management. Now, Shaun is happy to take questions, so he's going to do his presentation first and then he's going to do questions. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom, submit your questions, and right at the end, hopefully if I can speak properly, I'll help Shaun with the questions. So Shaun, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. No, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be invited to speak on such an important subject. I'm going to share my screen, so just bear with me while I do that and start up the presentation. There we go. So hopefully that's showing well. I do have a few slides, but I want to sort of get through the slides really just to set the scene a little bit around this enormous area an enormous challenge actually we're facing as an industry around building safety and fire safety, and then really get to some questions. I've done a few webinars. In fact, I did one this morning. And I find that the questions are actually the most interesting bit. So, I will share the slides with you, and you know, feel free to read them at your leisure. But I will go through them really just to pick up a couple of themes actually. So I can't promise to cover absolutely everything because, as I'm sure a lot of you know, we don't fully know what the full impact of this is going to be. We don't, you know, there are a number of bills, well, the two bills going through, the fire safety bill and the building safety bill, and a whole raft of secondary legislation will come as a result of those two bills. They haven't been enacted yet, and you know, we're still going through the process. So the fire safety bill is in the final stages, and in fact it was debated the other night. Some Lords amendments were rejected by the Commons. Those amendments were to do with leaseholder recovering costs from leaseholders. So the government have said all along that they didn't feel that leaseholders should pay for some of the issues arising out of building deficiencies, particularly around cladding and other fire-related issues. And the Lords wanted to amend the bill to make that clear, but of course that was rejected. And I'm sure Cassandra may have covered off some of these issues this morning, but it is very difficult to put that onto the landlords because they don't have funds, and you know, under current legislation they can recover costs. And I think the general feeling in industry is really the government should be providing more support to leaseholders to help them rectify building faults, if you like, that are leading to serious fire-related issues, which are not their fault. Many of which have arisen out of you know, standards not being adhered to, or standards not being correct at the time of build, and that's left many leaseholders in a very precarious situation. And of course, the effects of this are felt, as you know, far and wide. You know, it's not just the leaseholders. Obviously, at a time when, you know, the country's under enormous stress, the world's under enormous stress because of the global pandemic, and many leaseholders are feeling trapped in unsafe buildings. With flats they can't sell, they're struggling to get mortgages on if they're looking to buy, and this is creating a big sort of sticking point in the industry. The government have funded up to $5 billion, as you're probably aware, to help pay for remediation of cladding. The total cost estimate for cladding is at 15 million, so 3 times that figure. And the government have been putting pressure on developers to step in and do the right thing. And a few weeks ago, Taylor Wimpey announced that they would release 125 million to help rectify errors in their buildings, going back 20 years, actually, and not just cladding issues, but also other fire-related issues. And I know Persimmons have done a similar thing. So, but, 125 million versus 15 billion, it's a drop in the ocean. There's still an awful long way to go. So there's a lot of issues here. I can't answer all of those questions. I don't know exactly what's going to happen. But what I can talk a bit about is perhaps thinking about how to prepare for these changes, because one of the key things that has been muted by politicians and regulators is building owners and those that manage buildings need to start preparing for some of these changes now where they can. Of course, some of the changes we don't know what they're going to look like because the final shape of the legislation hasn't been determined. So we've still got a long way to go. A couple of things we do know, of course, we know that the buildings in scope, certainly for the building safety bill, has been set at 18 metres above ground or 6 stories. The Fire Protection Association, when they spoke about the MHCLG consolidated advice note that went out last year, and this advice note really was bringing together all of those advice notes that have been issued since Grenfell around cladding and other issues. But it made it clear here that building owners need to do more to address safety issues on residential buildings under 18 metres. So there's increasing pressure to think about buildings that are under 18 metres and think about other areas of risk as well. When we look at some of the fires, I've shared some of these slides, some of you may have seen these before. Worcester Park fire in September 2019, back in the good old days when we could get out and do things. Worcester Park, thankfully nobody was killed in this particular fire, but the building was burnt to the ground. It's a building under 18 metres, but fire was not well compartmented, so it spread very easily throughout the building. Bolton Cube fire, this is the student accommodation, again, just slightly under 18 metres, but a taller building. Again, raises issues around cladding and just the unusual spread of fire that can occur because of external wall systems. Thankfully, at the time, the Fire and Rescue Service recognised the unusual spread of fire and moved to get people out of that building as quickly as possible. And as a result of that, nobody was killed in this fire, but it could have been an awful lot worse. And the Crewe care home fire, a little bit more recent, August last year. Crewe care home, again, under 18 metres. Care homes don't fall into scope. But of course, what we see here is a building that's been almost completely destroyed because a fire that started in one part of the building spread quite rapidly through the whole building, largely the result of poor compartmentation, inadequate cavity barriers, which allowed that fire to spread from compartment to compartment very, very easily and very quickly in a timber frame build and almost completely destroy the whole complex. Despite the severity of this fire, again, and despite it being very vulnerable residents, thankfully nobody was killed. But it's it's a sobering thought to think that fires can spread in this way. So compartmentation in buildings, whether they're over 18 metres or under 18 metres, is a serious concern. And there have been a number of changes to building regulations for buildings over 11 metres. So there's a bit of pressure really to think about buildings perhaps that are maybe not quite 18 metres, but maybe over 11 metres, but also think about what needs to go into those buildings. So there have been improved standards around cladding material, installation of sprinklers for new builds, and other recommendations around those buildings which are due to come in as a result of the fire safety bill. I just wanted to point out some of the comments as well from the pre-legislative scrutiny on the building safety bill in particular. So as these bills sort of go through the process, there is plenty of opportunity for government and other sort of interested parties to consult on them. And the pre-legislative scrutiny is quite important because it kind of goes through each area of the bill in detail. And this particular one was around the definition of high-rise, this 18-metre, where the scrutiny largely agreed that this definition was reasonable and practical, though they also agreed with the evidence that calls for the scope to be widened in the future to include a greater number of risk factors. So I think we can expect to see almost like a trickle-down effect where obviously we're going to deal with new builds in scope first, then existing buildings, and then perhaps start to look at all buildings in terms of fire safety and enhancing the standards there. We're already seeing that now. The fire safety bill itself, I already mentioned, is in the final stages, so we're expecting this to come first. And the bill really, it looks at reforming the existing piece of legislation, the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, making clear that it applies to structure and external wall systems, so these will be included in the risk assessment process, and individual flat entrance doors between domestic premises and those non-domestic parts. And it will make it clear that the Fire and Rescue Service can enforce against non-compliance in relation to those parts as well. So this kind of fills a gap really that was there. And I think we're starting to see already, certainly in our team, we're starting to see a broadening of the fire risk assessment remit to capture many of these areas that were previously perhaps not included in the general scope of the fire risk assessment. And very importantly, the bill will provide a foundation for those critical Grenfell inquiry phase 1 recommendations, which the government have continually committed to implementing through legislation, probably secondary legislation once the bill has gone through. But we're still waiting for details on when that will be and how that will exactly happen. The Building Safety Bill, which will come later, of course, and again, we'll sort of work together with the Fire Safety Bill when that gets enacted or updates the Fire Safety Order. We'll make it clear that there are a number of duty holders, primarily the accountable person. So the accountable person will typically be the landlord or the freeholder. They will have the responsibility for obtaining a building assurance certificate, appointing a building safety manager, a brand new role that's never existed before. Although a lot of housing associations, local authorities have started to recruit people to this role, and the group that I got involved in a bit later on, Working Group 8, and the excellent work of Anthony Taylor, who chaired that group, Mark Snelling, who did a lot of work on the group, and Andy Frankham, who actually was the author of the competency framework. That's been largely accepted, and we have a competency framework for that new role. But what we don't know is exactly how many we're going to need. So we know there are 13, maybe 12 to 13,000 buildings over 18 metres. We know that maybe the ratio is something like 1 to 10, perhaps, maybe less, maybe more. So that's going to be somewhere in the region of 1,200 to 2,000 building safety managers, perhaps, that are needed. However, another option there is to perhaps think about organisational competence and the building safety manager role. So those ratios may not be true so far as an organisation may be able to appoint one building safety manager, and then maybe the responsibility of that role is disseminated to others, other property managers who become competent to do various aspects of that task under the watchful eye of a more qualified building safety manager. So there are different models being proposed here, and we haven't really settled on any particular one. And I'm very happy to take any questions on that. I don't know anything for certain, so please don't take anything I've read as policy. And then the safety case itself, again, a new thing. Most buildings don't have a safety case. Most property managers haven't probably heard of a safety case before, but we know that safety cases are used in other areas of health and safety, such as nuclear industry, oil and gas, other high-risk industries. And of course, Dame Judith Hackett was formerly headed up the regulator, the health and safety executive, so she's very familiar with the safety case concept. So it's no surprise to see it here in the proposed building safety bill. And really the safety case is that golden thread of information, and I'll sort of explain a bit more about that as we go through. And then of course the appointment of a new building safety regulator, which is currently in progress. The health and safety executive are leading that, and there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes to bring that together. And the kind of slightly controversial issue around building safety charge, which of course has been consulted on, and I know Armour have done a lot of work in explaining to government that actually the way in which that was currently presented probably is unworkable, and they need to rethink that a little bit. But Clearly, of course, many of these roles, the building safety manager, the requirements for the safety case will likely be things that are rechargeable to the leaseholder. So there's going to be a cost there, which needs to be thought about carefully. And the alignment of the bills, the building safety bill and the fire safety bill will work together, and this kind of this working together needs to be addressed really with some good guidance, good operational guidance as well, to make sure there's no contradiction. So it's kind of complicated because you've got enhanced fire safety requirements coming in with the update to the regulatory reform fire safety order, and you've got new duties and new requirements, quite onerous requirements actually, coming in as a result of the building safety bill. So it's really important to get these bits of legislation to work together effectively so that we don't end up with unintended consequences, if you like, of extra costs with no additional benefit. And going back to the pre-legislative scrutiny, there's a couple of issues that do arise out of that. So the role of the accountable person established in the bill is similar to the role of the responsible person, which is the current duty holder under the regulatory reform fire safety order, but they're using two different terms. This can be confusing. So the government is recommending that that there's a look at simplifying this, maybe rationalising it across these two regimes, so that there's no confusion. I mean, certainly in my experience, there is already a bit of confusion about responsible person, usually the landlord, of course, and then the accountable person again, which would be the landlord. So in most cases, that would be the same person or the same duty holder, but there may be exceptions to that, and it's really important to get that guidance right to avoid any confusion. And then another area which is a very strong area of focus is competency. So I've just picked out one of the areas. This is to do with the building safety manager. So the recommendation on the scrutiny was that the government think about legislation and guidance for a national system of accreditation to an agreed common standard. And this is where we've ended up with the Building Safety Alliance. So Working Group 8 did a lot of work thinking about the building safety manager competencies. The BSI are now developing frameworks around different stages, different gateways, so during construction design, all the way through to the actual framework for the specific role of building safety manager. And then we're looking at maybe registers of competence to give people some assurance that they can select a building safety manager that is indeed competent and is on a register. So that's current work that's ongoing. It's in the very, very early stages, but you can see that there's a sort of appetite here, both from the regulator perhaps and for industry, to get this bit right, because the building safety manager is going to be quite a key and pivotal role in this whole process. So again, just a bit more about the building safety manager here. Their key responsibility will be to manage that safety case report, which I'll explain in a minute, and work with the accountable person. So the building safety manager is there to assist the accountable person, if you like, in fulfilling their duties, and obviously making the building safe by managing the safety case report. They may be employed by the managing agent. They could be employed directly by the accountable person. They could be contracted in as a consultant. There are many different options. And of course, they would have to work with the regulator and any other duty holder in the building as well. So again, like I said, it's quite a pivotal role in the whole process. Just looking at the safety case itself, I've mentioned the safety case a number of times, and the safety case is this kind of unusual requirement, really, quite an onerous requirement. And going back to the explanatory note in the draft safety bill, which was published back in July last year, this is the definition of a safety case: a structured argument supported by a body of evidence that provides a compelling, comprehensible evidence and valid case as to how the accountable person is proactively managing fire and structural risks in order to prevent a major incident and limit the consequences to people in and around the building. It's quite a wordy definition. I mean, effectively, the safety case report is that justification based on all the information that should go into the golden thread. So it's all that stuff you'd expect to have on a building, how it was built, is it well compartmented, what are the fire systems in the building, and so on. So a lot of buildings in occupation don't have all of this information, so there's a bit of a gap, and this is what the safety case report is designed to fill. The pre-legislative scrutiny really picked up on this by recognising, of course, that the safety case report is probably one of the most onerous responsibilities on the accountable person. And in order to prepare for the implementation, industry needs to know what the safety case report will look like and what information it must contain. So there's a big question mark over this. What is a safety case report? What should it look like? There are lots of early adopters who have sought to produce safety case reports. In fact, we're doing some work with some big clients at the moment in helping them prepare information for a safety case report as a bit of a trial run, bit of a pilot study, and that's going extremely well. But really the government needs to publish guidance, certainly soon, I think, and at the latest alongside the bill before it gets enacted, outlining what information a safety case report will be required to contain. And this is important because Dame Judith Hackett made it very clear that everyone needs to start taking action now. So industry, this is a quote from Dame Judith, industry must be in no doubt, but it's not enough to wait for the bill to become law before they implement changes. We expect them to start taking action now. So in terms of sort of rectifying that gap in building information, I think really that means sort of beginning to build your safety case as best you can. So we've looked at this, of course, and I know others have as well, and we've kind of come up with a number of areas that we feel would feed into a safety case report. And it's worth remembering that a safety case report is a document which will be something like 12 to 20 pages long. It's not a long document. It's really the justification, if you like, that brings together all these bits of information, all these bits of the golden thread, everything from the building design information, if it's available, or structural design, external wall system survey, compartmentation surveys or a type 4 risk assessment, details of fire doors, a fire strategy. You may not have a fire strategy on your existing building, but if you've received a new building, you will probably have a fire strategy. So that's something we normally see with new builds. Fire safety management plan, and resident engagement strategy, which of course you may or may not have. All of these things would be required to feed into that. And you probably need something for it to sit on, a fire risk management system, to demonstrate how your organisation is set up to manage fire risks across the whole portfolio. And something we think is really important is the software system. How do you demonstrate that you're closing out actions from the fire risk assessments and everything else? How do you keep track of that? Because often they can be very large numbers of actions that you need to keep track of. So I think online management systems, online software systems have a huge role to play here in helping us sort of comply with these duties. And regulators, I think, will expect to see organisations doing things like this far more proactively. So just to whiz through a couple of the issues, of course, are really, really important with all of this. There's a lot of fire-related issues that can occur in a block, but one of the things that really worry fire risk assessors is where you see really significant compartmentation breaches. That is, holes in buildings where there shouldn't be holes, fire stopping missing, which will allow potentially smoke and flame and heat to spread from compartment to compartment. This is so vitally important in residential blocks because all of these residential blocks are built to support, or should be built to support, a stay put policy. And that stay put policy is only valid if the building is very well compartmented. So it's no surprise that we're seeing an increase in regulators asking for evidence that the building can support the stay put policy. And that evidence would be in the form of either a type 4 fire risk assessment, a more intrusive risk assessment, or a compartmentation survey, which would just be looking at the compartments. And what we'd be looking for is evidence like this. We might even go into walls using an endoscope to view whether there are sufficient cavity barriers. And we might be looking for evidence of poor fire stopping, for example, where maybe previously it's been raised on a fire risk assessment. You've asked a company to come in and do the fire stopping, and this is what they've done. And then that's been picked up on future risk assessments because we wouldn't consider that to be suitable and sufficient fire stopping. What do we expect to see? Well, we expect to see something a little bit more substantial, fire stopped on both sides of the wall, using correct material, maybe using proper coupling material to prevent the spread of fire, and being signed off. You can see the label there that's been signed off there, been approved to a particular standard to demonstrate that the fire stopping has been done to a standard. It could be a base standard or other standard that's being applied. So there's a bit of work to do around this area, I think, in terms of making sure that the people that do fire stopping work are competent to do it, and also perhaps making sure you've got the right levels of assurance to demonstrate that you know how to select a competent company to do this type of work. Doors are really critically important, and there's been a very strong emphasis on doors in the bill and post Grenfell as well. It's not just the door itself in terms of it being a 30-minute or a 60-minute door with intermittent strips. All of that's fine, but if a door has no self-closer on it, then all of those features are pointless, really, because the door will just stay open when somebody leaves that flat. And we know that most fires, actually, where there's a good door, will be contained within the flat of origin. Certainly less than 10% of fires spread beyond the flat of origin where the door is closed. So flat front entry doors have a very significant role to play, and that's why there's a very strong focus on them. And in the bill itself, there are some recommendations around frequency of inspection, door inspections and door audits will become a requirement. We're certainly seeing more of that. And I think also maybe what we call a type 3 risk assessment, where we go in, we get to the other side of the door. So at the moment, many risk assessments are done as type 1, common parts only, not going into the tenant's demise. But maybe there's a future where we need to do a lot more than that. Now, I know a lot of property owners do this, but there are some that don't. And I appreciate it can be difficult as well, because you have to make arrangements with the leaseholder to do that. But future legislation will likely make that much easier to achieve, and that's going to be very beneficial, I think, for overall block safety. How many would you need to do? Well, I've heard figures of around 10% talked about doing a 10% sample of tenant demise areas, just to check on the other side of the door to make sure there's nothing unusual going on there. And that just picks up on what I was saying around different types. So you probably, when I talk about type 1, I'm talking about the most basic fire risk assessment, just in the common parts and non-destructive. Type 3s I've mentioned as well, common parts and demised areas, non-destructive, and type 4 and type 2, which tend to be more destructive surveys, where you start to look at the compartmentation, getting inside the building to check that the right fire cavities are in place. You can do that either as a type 4, which would cover all the areas of a type 1 and all the other fire-related issues, or as simply a separate compartmentation survey. And we've seen a massive increase in the demand for compartmentation surveys, largely off the back of regulators are asking for evidence that the building can support the stay put strategy, which naturally leads to asking for a compartmentation survey to be done. And the main thing I'd say about that is you've got to make sure it's done by a competent person, somebody who knows how to do that and they've got experience in it. And I'd get several quotes as well, because I've seen some wild and wonderful variations in quotations for compartmentation surveys, from a couple of £1,000 up to £20,000. So you need to be careful that you're giving good value for money to your leaseholders when you get those surveys booked in. And typically for a type 1 risk assessment, it's a visual inspection. It's usually sufficient. So there's a couple of things to think about here. Type 1 may recommend other types of survey, like a compartmentation or an external wall system survey. It's unlikely that your fire risk assessor will be able to do all of that just as they turn up. So you normally have to make sure these things are booked separately. And external wall system surveys may require specialist surveyors to look at those particular areas that may be beyond the scope of your existing fire risk assessor. These are often combined with general health and safety. I'm a big fan of this because I think it saves a lot of money. So I tend to fight the corner for combined health, safety, fire risk assessments, because I think if you do them separately, it just costs a lot more money. Often the people that do the fire risk assessment are quite capable of doing health and safety as well, and certainly that's an approach we take as a company. And I think combining assessments as much as possible into a single visit is a good idea, provides good value for money. It is now recognised that many buildings will require that type 4 perhaps, but you wouldn't be doing that every year. You'd only be doing that maybe once every 5 years. And in fact, the safety case report itself would need to be reviewed at 5-year intervals. So your kind of more intrusive type survey and a review of your safety case will probably coincide at that 5-year interval. But in the intervening years, you probably only need to do a type 1 risk assessment. And the risk assessment, in our view, needs to be based on good building information. So you'll get a better risk assessment if all the other building information is in place, such as a fire strategy. So that begs the question, what is a fire strategy? Well, fire strategies, if you've taken on a new building, you'll be familiar with them. They're commonly developed during that design phase for a new building or refurbishment project. They're usually those sort of clear evaluation of the building that takes on board the fire precautions and management and fire protection. And the fire strategy will provide building owners, occupiers and managers with all the information on which to develop and implement effective prevention and protection measures. And just seeing if I've got the outputs. Yeah, I did put them in. So the outputs you'd expect from a fire strategy, which is very different than a fire evacuation strategy. So sometimes there's a bit of confusion. A fire evacuation strategy is simply something that would be determined by the risk assessment and often articulated in the fire risk assessment. A fire strategy document is a bigger, more involved document which incorporates evacuation strategy, but also incorporates other things like the management of fire, more detail on the fire smoke control system, firefighting measures like fire extinguishers in boiler rooms or basements, and overarching fire protection of the building. So it's a more detailed, comprehensive document on which everything else can kind of sit. And then lastly, really, I'll stop in a minute so we can have a discussion and I can answer some questions. But the fire risk management system is an issue that is there in the existing legislation. Actually, the existing legislation does say that the responsible person must have arrangements in place for the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring, and review of preventative and protection measures. This largely goes overlooked. And I think the move towards more scrutiny and more requirements, if you like, with the Building Safety Bill will make this more relevant, because you won't be able to write a good safety case without demonstrating you've got a fire risk management system in place. British standards do provide a system actually in the form of BS 9997, and this is based on a familiar model. If you've got an ISO 9000 model in your company, you will recognise this plan, do, check, act cycle. It's based on the Deming wheel, which underpins many management systems. You wouldn't need necessarily to have accreditation to BS 9997, but I know a lot of housing associations and other bodies are looking at moving towards this standard of accreditation. And effectively, this is looking at the more holistic management system for management throughout the whole company. So have you got plans and procedures? Do you know who the responsible people are? Do you have proper arrangements for doing risk assessments and surveys, training your staff, making sure you've got a good method for selecting competent risk assessors, and then the kind of check and act section in terms of, do you check what you're doing? And that's why these management systems, the software systems, become very important. Do you know where you are? Are you improving in closing out actions? Are you doing less well? How are you demonstrating that? And then, of course, the whole reviewing that whole process in order to maybe rethink the whole plan. And it goes round and round and round in a nice sort of management cycle. So this is a kind of an additional thing that many organisations won't have in place, but actually could be very useful in improving efficiency in terms of how you manage fire safety. So just going back to the model, and this is the kind of model for the safety case report, all the things you may need to start thinking about putting into place in advance of the bill coming into legislation. Just to finish on the software as well, I think the software system, in terms of managing that golden thread of information, is going to become ever more important. And of course, we have a system called Prism, which we market and many of our clients use. Other providers have their own systems. So there's many of these systems out there. They can be very useful in demonstrating or providing evidence of proactive task management, as well as providing a document library, perhaps for the safety case documents to sit and the safety case report. It could link to the resident engagement strategy, and of course it will provide really important support to the building safety manager. If I was a building safety manager, I think I would insist on having a system to help me manage the sort of complexities in a building, particularly if I was responsible for managing 10 blocks. I want to have a system to help me do that. So I think these systems are going to become more important, and certainly we're doing a lot of work in the background to develop our system. So I'm going to draw it to a close. I did try to go rapidly through that in 30 minutes. I'm a little bit over that, so apologies, but hopefully it leaves a bit of time for some questions. If I don't get to answer your question today and you want to get in contact with me, these are my contact details, shaun.lundy@tetraconsulting.co.uk, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to link into me if you want to keep a link going and see things we post. So thanks very much for your attention. Hopefully I'll be able to address some questions. Shaun, I think some people have put questions in Q&A, haven't they? And I mean, others may want to just jump in.
Yeah, you've definitely got some questions. So okay. The first one is, I apologise if you've already covered this, but when is the fire safety bill due to be completed and issued?
That is $1 million question. It is pretty imminent. I think last year I said July. I was talking about a July date, and I don't think I'm far off that, because it's in its final stages now, and the government are under a lot of pressure to get this moving, because there's a lot of dissatisfaction. It's taken quite a number of years just to get to this point. I mean, you can forgive the government a bit, they have a lot on their minds recently. So, but they talk about spring. That was their original plan. I mean, we're in spring now. It's in the final stages. Spring, as far as I understand, the government lasts until June. So, maybe end of June, July. I would really hope to see something, before July. That would be my hope. I think it's probably quite imminent. So fingers crossed, we'll see it very soon, because I think we all need to know what it looks like, and we all want to get on with it, really.
Absolutely. Okay, the next question. Please, could you clarify what happens in blocks where they have very nice period entrance doors with lots of glazed areas, and where residents simply don't want the doors replaced? I've been unable to find a single firm willing to provide quotes for replacing such doors with FD30 doors or similar design and style. Any idea?
Yeah, I mean, David, that's it's a tricky one. I used to work at the UNESCO World Heritage Site at Greenwich, obviously the University of Greenwich, and a beautiful building, but we had, there were lots of issues around doors there, because a lot of them are beautiful old doors, but not necessarily conforming to FD30 standards. So I think what will change as we move forward is that the responsibility for dealing with that will very much sit with the leaseholder themselves. So they can kind of say they don't want to do it, but actually the regulator can start to enforce against them as individuals, and that may change things a little bit. So I think that's where we might get things moving. I mean, there is a lot of dissatisfaction. I think people feel that they're going to lose their beautiful door, and they're going to end up with a door that looks horrendous. Very factory-looking door. I know there's a few companies out there that do produce nice doors, which are also FD30 doors. They're not cheap though; they're very expensive. So I think all I can say is it's important to remind them of what the obligations are around the door to improve them. And I think as we move into the new regime, you're gonna get the support of the regulator in a way that they couldn't support you before. So that will help, hopefully.
Okay, so who can sign off fire stopping? I know FIRAS, but hardly any contractors in my part of the world, and there are those that don't want to do small work.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, actually. I mean, I know it's interesting. We've been asked to look at fire stopping from time to time as a kind of almost like an external audit type role. I suppose in many respects, what we're looking for is who did it, what were their qualifications, and do they comply with any particular system, and then seeing whether we feel by looking at it whether it's been done correctly. So in a way, most of that should be picked up on the fire risk assessment to a point. And of course, it can be expensive to get someone like us to go around and do that as a separate activity. So I'm not always sure that's the right way of doing it. I mean, I'd like to see more guidance on this because, I mean, I highlight it here because I know it's an issue, and it's something that, you know, I would certainly put pressure on the government and the regulator to provide better guidance on what good looks like when it comes to fire stopping, because I think it's a huge gap. So it's a really great question. I'm really sorry I can't answer it better, actually, at the moment.
Yeah, tricky one. Okay, will property managers be able to charge a separate management fee and accountant's fee under the building safety charge?
Well, this, I'm pretty sure Cassandra flipped one over to me from her morning session, and this might be one I'd send back to her, actually. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think there are some details to be resolved here about how to recover costs. I think we're still waiting for that detail. So I think that's a difficult one for me to answer. I'd like a leasehold lawyer to be sat next to me, sort of whispering in my ear, really, to help me better answer that question. I mean, interestingly, over the last year or so, I've got much more involved in Landlord and Tenant Act type issues, especially looking at the reforms that are coming around the corner there as well, because it has such a massive impact on fire safety. You know, a lot of the problems we have, the sticky problems where we can't move things on, are because of who pays. You know, so I think these are really key things.
Okay. Often we don't have any plans or even know the architect for a building. I see regularly that the developer and the architect don't even bother with a fire risk assessment strategy.
Yeah, well, under building regulations, if it's a new build or a major refurbishment, they are actually required to produce a strategy. But I do see some examples where they're not done, or they're done very poorly. In fact, our Rob Taylor, who's our director of health, safety, fire, he's a fire engineer. He does a lot of our fire strategies, actually, because they're more complex documents. They require somebody, you know, he's a fellow of the Institute of Fire Engineers, so he's very well qualified. In fact, he did the fire strategy in the Shard, so he's very experienced guy. But he sees some very poor fire strategies from new builds, you know, that are obviously done during the construction phase, which in occupation don't necessarily fully represent the building. So he's doing lots of fire strategies for existing buildings and improving fire strategies for new buildings which aren't right. But I'd be pretty insistent, actually, if it was a new build, I would say, well, where's the fire strategy? Because you really should be providing one. I don't think there's a good reason not to, actually. And maybe they've done it and they're not sharing it. That's often the case. It's buried somewhere in the health and safety file if it's a CDM project.
Okay, so I've got another one from Mark. An assessment is only really as good as the day on which it is done. A leaseholder could replace a door closer to the assessment and remove it once it is done. Is there anything within the bill that compels the leaseholder not to touch?
Not touch a closer. Yeah, so it's a really good. Yeah, it's a good question, and there isn't actually. And the only thing that's in there is that it makes it very clear that doors, flat front entry doors, are within scope of that bill. And what that means is, if you own that door, then if you do anything, if you tamper with it or make it less effective, then you are liable legally if it's shown that you presented a risk to everyone else. Now, I think the only thing you can do there is to remind people of their duties. So one of the things I think will come out of the bill is maybe a requirement to educate leaseholders on these new changes to help them understand the important role that they play in fire safety throughout the whole building. And tampering with door closers is the big one. And I do understand it. I mean, my eldest son, I used to live in a flat. My eldest son is disabled. He's in his 30s now, and he's got cerebral palsy. And he couldn't open my door, my flat front entrance door. With the closer, it's just too difficult for him to open it. So that is a concern. And I would have, if I wasn't a fire safety person, I might have been tempted to take it off. But there are ways you can do it. Because I knew how they worked, I was able to adjust it, make it easier to operate, but still operate, and figure out a way of helping him. So I think there's a lot of education to do there around door closers. But like I said in the presentation, if it's not got its door closer on and it's just swinging open when you leave your flat because it's on fire, doesn't matter whether it's a 30, 60, 2-hour fireproof door with all the brilliant bells and whistles on it. If it's not closed, it's not going to do any good. So door closers are important. Okay,
so what is the cut-off date for a new build classification?
That's a good question. In terms of when the bill will come into place, that hasn't been determined yet. So I think that probably means when, for example, if the bill applies to new buildings, when will that date be? So that hasn't been determined. I mean, there have been some requirements that have come in last November around sprinkler systems in buildings over 11 metres.
Mm-hmm.
And a date, I can't remember the exact date, but basically that meant that buildings being, subject to sort of approval had to comply with that requirement in terms of plans and design. How that will work with the building safety bill, I'm not exactly sure, actually. There's no clear timeline on that yet.
A question from Emma: have you experienced problems with where leaseholders store items in communal hallways? We have a zero tolerance policy on this, but residents don't like it.
Yeah, I mean, this takes me back to my Guinness days, actually, when I used to be a group head of health, safety, fire at Guinness Partnership, and we, in certain parts of our partnership, we had a zero tolerance policy, but it used to cause no end of problems. People really weren't happy, and I remember going down to a residents meeting where it was very hostile because people wanted to put things in the communal parts. I tend to be a little bit more pragmatic. I mean, I understand that zero tolerance is important in some circumstances, and actually the leaseholder doesn't have any right to put anything in the common parts because they don't have a lease on it. Those common parts are simply for them to walk in and out of to get to their leased area. So there's no automatic entitlement to put anything in the common parts, and there's a very good reason for fire safety not to do it. I mean, sometimes what gets people's backs up is if you just tell them they can't do things, and people just generally don't like that. I think the British public have demonstrated that on many occasions. And I remember, again, going back to my example with my son, we lived in a flat, and I remember people putting doormats outside their flat, quite chunky ones actually. And I lived in the end flat, so I couldn't get past all of that in a wheelchair. I had him in a wheelchair to get into the flat, and I'm bumping up and down these doormats. It became very, very difficult. So I popped a note through everyone's door saying, look, I'm having really difficulty getting Michael to the flat because of your doormats. And, the next day they were all gone. They were all gone because, but the thing is, if I put a note through everyone's door and said, hey, I'm a fire safety consultant, and your doormat's in breach of the regulatory reform fire safety order, I think they would have put things through my letterbox, actually. So I think it's kind of how you communicate it and using all the tools at your disposal. So it is a fire safety issue, but it's also a Landlord and Tenants Act issue as well. It's the fact they shouldn't be storing anything in there. And then there's the managed use thing where you can sort of say, okay, well, we'll allow some things as long as it's reasonable. And that just takes a lot more management. So I understand why you go for zero tolerance. But again, education, thinking about all those different reasons actually why it might not be a good idea, as well as fire safety.
Okay. Amy said, if doors do not comply or other things in the block do not comply, what responsibilities fall on the property managers to sort it out?
Well, I mean, effectively, if you're the property manager, you're acting on behalf of your landlord, who, under these circumstances, is either the responsible person or the accountable person, and they have the responsibility to resolve those issues, because and therefore, if they don't do that, and a notice is served by the regulator, the fire rescue service, for example, that would be served on the accountable person. So they would be the ones going to court. So the property manager, I suppose, by association, has that responsibility to assist with that process, but the responsible person would have the duty to make sure there are reasonable funds available. Now, of course, that would be recoverable. Those costs are recoverable because they are amounting to sort of legal breaches. But the property manager would be expected to know, and the only way you know really is by getting the right level of advice in. Good competent advice, I think, is really key here.
Okay. Is there any definitive guidance on the accountable person role and also the extent of delegation of duties to managing agents?
No, not apart from what's in the building safety bill. If you go online, there's some explanatory notes there, and it does discuss the accountable person in the explanatory notes. Really, it's more about who the accountable person is rather than more explanation as to what they should be doing. And we are waiting for more guidance around that. But I can't remember the second part of the question. Was it to do with the might be in a dismiss thing? So I just want to make sure I answer the question correctly.
Yeah, I was just going back down. Is there any definitive guidance on the accountable person role and also the extent of the delegation of duties to managing agents?
Yeah, nothing really on the extent of delegation of duties, because I think we're expecting to see a bit more of that in guidance, actually. I know Armour are doing some work in the background around these sort of things, and we're reissuing, actually. There's a very good guide that Armour produce on fire safety, and we're reissuing that. And that's going to be continually updated, actually, in light of new information. And it's very focused on the managing agent's responsibility. So I think that's where you're going to get the information you need, really, is from organisations like Armour and others.
And I've got one more question from Emma. What do you think a riser cupboard is for? I have an argument with residents that they shouldn't be used. The lease is one element, of course, but they say they have FD 30 doors and fire stopping, so surely it's okay.
Yeah, so the riser cupboard is where you've got you've probably got a system that will allow water through the building. Usually you find those cupboards have got FD 30 doors on them. I mean, I would recommend locking them. I don't think they really should be used for anything else, storage or anything like that. They really shouldn't be used for that purpose. And I would recommend securing them where you can. It's very important, actually, because a lot of riser cupboards are open. They're open between floors, so the door provides a compartment to that whole compartment that may run the entire length of the building. So it's very important that they are always closed. They should be secure, and you shouldn't be really storing anything in them that could be flammable or potentially ignitable. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Excellent. Wow.
We're almost at time. That's almost perfect timing.
That is almost perfect timing. I'm seriously impressed. Thank you very much for sharing.
Some really great questions, actually. Really great. I really hope I answered the questions. If I didn't, please just drop me a line. I know some of these things are much more complicated and often need a bit more explanation, but I did my best.
You've done great. And we will be sending out your presentation to everybody who's attended anyway, and your contact details will be on there as well. So if anybody wants to get in contact with you directly, that won't be an issue. So that is about it for our Leasehold Knowledge Week. Thank you very much, everyone who's joined us this last week. If you want to go to any more sessions, News on the Block, if you go to our website, we've got more events and training sessions. And in mid-April, we're going to be working alongside the Ringley Group to host their sessions on the golden thread of information, which will be presented by Marianne Bowring. So, without further ado, thank you all so much for joining us this week. And Shaun, once again, thank you very much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Vicky. I really enjoyed these events, so thanks very much for inviting me.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
That's great, and thank everyone for listening.